Hello, my name is Skelton, and I'm a senior at the University of North Texas, and I will be presenting on a recent work by Kader Attia entitled Arab Spring. In 2015, at Art Basel Unlimited, Kader Attia reenacted the vandalism and looting of the Egyptian Museum of Cairo that took place during the Egyptian Revolution of 2011 in a performance entitled Arab Spring. This is footage taken from AP News documenting the extent of the looting and vandalism that occurred to the actual museum at that time. The performance consisted of Attia donning, as one commentator put it, the uniform of the disenfranchised worldwide, otherwise known as the hoodie, while tossing rubble through empty display cases resembling those used to exhibit cultural artifacts in the Egyptian Museum of Cairo. Notice Attia here tossing bricks through display cases that look nearly identical to those in the previous image. My familiarity with the performance is through video and photos found on social media and art blogs. This documentation, the crowd that made it, and the performances document will be the focus of my presentation. One video found on Vimeo shows Attia slowly walking between rows of display cases. He picks up what appears to be building rubble, bricks, stone, concrete, tiles. Sometimes underhand, sometimes overhand, he throws it through the glass display cases. The pane shattering, Attia turns his head or raises an arm to shield his face from the flying debris. All in all, a bit more careful, more controlled than one typically thinks of with this sort of thing. The flash of a camera reflected in the glass draws attention to the reflection of the large crowd in attendance. Attia, after breaking most of the vitrines, concludes. He seems exhausted. The crowd applauds. This performance has been described in ways that suggest it be understood as a metaphor for the violence and unrest we witness portrayed in the media on a nearly daily basis. For instance, the empty vitrines suggest Michael Anthony Farley could be filled with whatever politics we choose to project into them. The riots surrounding the murder of Trayvon Martin, the Banlieue riots of '05, the Egyptian Revolution of 2011, and so forth. I, however, propose a different reading, one that focuses on, in addition to the content of the performance, its extended milieu, which includes the art fair and the crowd of spectators documenting the event with mobile devices. This reading, one that takes us beyond simple metaphor and takes into account the network of complex spatial and temporal relations the performance and its location are enmeshed in, can be considered topological. Topology is a branch of geometry that describes spatial and temporal relations between points, lines, and planes where standard Euclidean geometry fails. Topology allows linking near and far, up, I apologize, but I missed one. Up with down, in with out, and is traditionally visualized as a Mobius strip. In critical theory, topology is used to think about relationships between elements whose connectedness may not be evident and where the reader or audience's response and interpretation is valued over authorial intention. Meaning in motion rather than fixed. The value of this approach is that it helps us to interpret the performance in a novel way and to generate ideas about it that might not otherwise be considered. Topology has been used to describe Attia's approach in previous works. For instance, in Attia's work, Open Your Eyes, Kobina Mercer demonstrates how one is struck by the similarity of the war-ravaged faces of soldiers subjected to early forms of reconstructive surgery and their twin representation in the similarly crudely reconstructed African mask. While the similarity is uncanny, a direct correlation is unlikely unless one considers the relation between that which at first seems unrelated and instead thinks of objects and events in topological continuity. I suggest that understanding Arab Spring as topological helps us to reflect upon the history of colonialism, representations of the Orient, consumption, and how these connect with contemporary political events. I argue that the connections between these elements are important because they reveal a persistent problem with the misrepresentation of the Middle East by Western societies. To demonstrate this, I will discuss the revolutionary period commonly referred to as the Arab Spring, not to be confused with the performance of the same name. Some of the ways it has been represented: the Mission Civilisatrice, or civilizing mission, Orientalist painting, and the Egyptian Museum of Cairo. I will then speculate on the possible repercussions and connections Arab Spring reveals. The title of Attia's performance refers to a series of events, protests, and revolutions set in motion by the self-immolation of Mohammed Bouazizi following abuse at the hands of Tunisian police on December 17, 2010. This event is commonly referred to as the Arab Spring. It is important to note, however, that this particular term and the narrative it implies are highly contentious. For instance, Joseph Massad, in an op-ed for Al Jazeera Online, argues that the Arab Spring is an American invention coined in the journal Foreign Policy that links the event to the Prague Spring of 1968, and thus a particular Eurocentric narrative of democracy, evolution, and economic liberalization. Similarly, these events have been referred to as the Twitter revolution. This designation emphasizes the technological aspect held to have played a decisive role in the Arab Spring. In particular, the use of social media by protesters for disseminating information and organizing the masses. While it is certain that social media did indeed play a role in these events, it is highly debatable to what extent. For example, data analysis of social media use during these events have suggested that the Twitter revolution is best understood as a massive consumption of data outside of the Middle East and North African region, as the vast majority of social media use occurred outside of this region. Additionally, many protesters bristle with indignation at the suggestion that the revolution was a Twitter war, instead emphasizing the presence on the ground and in the streets. This characterization tends towards a narrative that, like the term Arab Spring, places events within a Eurocentric narrative of democracy and progress. It differs, however, in that it focuses on the technological achievements of a consumerist society and appropriates the success of these revolutions as proof of its liberatory nature of capitalist innovation and its products. While it is unclear to what extent social media played a role in this revolutionary period, we can say with some assurance that framing the event as the Twitter revolution is insensitive and inaccurate unless we mean the unprecedented way in which global audiences followed or consumed the events. A number of sociological studies regarding the events collectively known as the Arab Spring emphasize the use of social media using the language of theater. Jeffrey C. Alexander's Performative Revolution in Egypt, an essay in cultural power, is exemplary in this regard. His analysis suggests that the events that began on January 25th in Egypt should be understood as a living drama with plot-compelling protagonists, despicable antagonists, and whose success was dependent upon it communicating a narrative drama to Western audiences with the aim of intervention. While this characterization is problematic for a variety of reasons, not least of all the conflation of a real event with the comparative triviality of theater, it is in keeping with the suggestion that social media representations of the Arab Spring were largely consumed, in some cases, we can speculate, as entertainment, by those outside of the region, and that it is consistent with the continuing mischaracterization of the Arab world by the West. Attia's performance facilitates reflection upon these elements and the larger issues of misrepresentation and consumption they are a part of when we consider the audience's behavior, their use of social media to document the performance, as being one point in a web of continuum of interconnected events and meanings that the performance brings together. Up to this point, I've discussed recent political issues. I would now like to focus on the Mission Civilisatrice and how Arab Spring invites us to reflect upon its connection to contemporary events. I use here the term Mission Civilisatrice not only for its specific historical context, a term used by the French to justify colonialism as a mission of bringing enlightenment and civilization to supposedly inferior cultures, but also understood more broadly as common justification for imperialism used by many colonial powers. Edward Said, in his essay, Knowing the Orient, demonstrates that this mission and its justification were supported by a self-affirming body of knowledge that found its expression in European literature, museums, and art. The body of knowledge and specialization surrounding the Orient cast the Oriental in binary opposition to the European. The European was modern, industrious, logical, while the Oriental was atemporal, exotic, idle, and so forth. Linda Nochlin provides an excellent example of this system of representation at work in her canonical analysis of Jean-Léon Gérôme's The Snake Charmer. This scene portrays a whole cast of exotic characters absorbed in childish, trance-like concentration at the performance at hand. The scene seems as if plucked straight from the past, except for the state of disrepair and the ornate tilework and the presence of firearms that break the temporal ambiguity. You can see there, there's broken tiles, and these gentlemen are holding rifles. Nochlin suggests that this superbly rendered scene, often discussed for its photographic quality and objectivity, presupposes, precisely because of its apparent objectivity, the presence of the Western observer as consumer of the exotic spectacle. Not only was this work thought of as dauntingly objective and documentary-like, but as Nochlin suggests, certain details, namely the broken tilework and ill-repaired architecture, function as a standard topos in 19th century Orientalist art for commenting upon the corruption of contemporary Islamic culture. Basically, the painting provides visual evidence for and is supported by the narrow, prejudiced body of knowledge it is a part of and that was used to justify the civilizing mission, the mission to bring enlightenment and reason to the uncivilized world. Variants of this line of reasoning abound to this day. The United States invasion and subsequent occupation of Iraq, popularly cast as a humanitarian mission with the aim of spreading democracy, is a particularly apt example, as is the topic at hand, the appropriation of the Arab Spring or Twitter revolution as part of a Eurocentric narrative of progress. It isn't too difficult to see how Attia's performance connects with Linda Nochlin's analysis of the Snake Charmer regarding the gaze of the observer. In Arab Spring, their gaze is literally reflected in the glass, but it is less obvious how it connects to the civilizing mission and the system of representation that supports it. I argue that the context of the performance, the looting of the Egyptian Museum of Cairo on January 28, 2011, helps us to see the connection between the two. Attia's interpretation of the looting of the museum allows us to consider the museum's function in reinforcing and circulating the representational strategies that support the civilizing mission. The vitrines, which Attia destroys, are identical to those found in the Egyptian Museum of Cairo, with the exception that they are empty rather than filled with Egypt's cultural heritage. These vitrines are characteristic of 19th century museological practice, ethnographic museums, and the Wunderkammers from which they are derived. This method of presentation typically displays a variety of objects isolated from and with little regard to their original context, intention, or meaning, instead emphasizing the object as subject of aesthetic appreciation or index of cultural progress, with, of course, Europe in the lead. In a previous work of Attia's, The Repair from Occidental to Extra-Occidental Cultures, presented at Documenta 13, Attia explicitly addresses the system of representation in its relation to appropriation and modernity. Arab Spring's use of the vitrines works similarly, but because Attia directs his violence towards the vitrines, and thus the system of representation they symbolize, Arab Spring suggests another connection, one that implicates the audience, like the Snake Charmer, as a consumer of the spectacle, although the object of consumption in this regard is more perverse, violence and revolution. In addition to the representational strategies employed by the institution, Arab Spring also exploits the specific history of the Egyptian Museum itself by staging his performance as a historical reenactment. This history, which includes the museum's French origins and directorship to its decidedly European Beaux Arts architecture, not surprisingly designed by a Frenchman, highlights how the museum is entangled with its colonial past and the interests of foreign powers. Although established in 1859, not until 1950 did the Egyptian Museum of Cairo fill the role of director with a native Egyptian, Imam Hamza. And to this very day, foreign interests are thoroughly embedded in the institution. For instance, the museum's current state of renovation, outlined in a publication put out by the Ministry of Antiquities, illustrates that the project is a joint effort between foreign and domestic institutions, much of the museological specialization and funding coming from Europe. An analysis of this publication reveals a surprising amount of anxiety and self-consciousness regarding Egypt's image on the world stage. The document suggests an eagerness to project an image of a modern, progressive Egypt, and bemoans the status of the collection as being below international standards. A particularly telling example refers to the degraded state of the museum being captured by every camera and communicated to the outside world in social and conventional media. My goal here is not to suggest that the renovation is purely an imperial affair, nor that those involved are acting solely out of self-interest, but to demonstrate how persistent the colonial system of representation is in its connection to the civilizing mission regarding the museum's embarrassment, regarding its incompetent management and the disrepair of its cultural treasures. Thus, Attia's use of this seemingly one neutral element, the vitrine, connects the work to a vast network of interrelated spatio-temporal objects, the history of colonialism, representation, and appropriation in the region, institutional history, the rhetoric of colonial architecture, and so forth, and shows us how even the most innocuous of objects are anything but neutral, or rather a part of a much larger web of relations. Considered from a topological perspective, Kader Attia's Arab Spring helps us to consider the interconnectedness between a vast network of seemingly disparate objects and events, which is important because it facilitates a rich interpretation of Attia's work and invites critical reflection upon the history of representation in regard to Western relations with the so-called Middle East and how these are reflected in the art fair and its consumptive nature. This interpretation is made possible by considering the extended environment the performance is enmeshed in, the art fair and its attendees, in its relation to a larger sphere of spatial and temporal events. The art fair attendees' documentation of the performance with mobile devices and its dissemination via social media in the context of an artistic imitation of a real historical event provides us with an opportunity to contemplate our own consumption of media and the narratives and representations we take for granted. Understanding Attia's work topologically has allowed us to consider how terms used to describe events, Arab Spring or Twitter Revolution, are inseparable from the larger constellation that connects the colonial past with contemporary events. In conclusion, Kader Attia's Arab Spring might be best understood as belonging to a new turn in contemporary art that combines topological connectivity, a novel approach to audience participation, and that utilizes carefully calculated artifice or mimesis as a means of producing a situation that puts meaning into motion and helps illuminate the normally hidden structures of capitalism and imperialism that shape our lives and threaten to turn even revolution into a product for consumption. Thank you.
And now questions, please, for Alan. Where was this performance?
It was done in Geneva, Switzerland, at Art Basel Unlimited. So relatively exclusive art fair setting.
Okay, thank you.
Yes?
And what is Attia's background? Is she from Egypt?
It's a man, and he's the name doesn't necessarily reveal anything. He is a French Algerian, and he spent time. His family immigrated to France when he was younger. He actually lived in the banlieues, which are a primarily Middle Eastern ghetto that's separated by a highway from the more integrated Paris. And it has in the past been the site of riots and also radicalization and also just generally an unintegrated neighborhood, which based on recent events we can see is that lack of integration is a real problem in French society. Yes?
How is like seeing sociological situations implemented in current art history? And I was wondering what started your interest on this topic.
Well, interestingly enough, my actual my awareness of the Twitter element of it sort of, I think, goes back to the riots in Greece, actually. When those occurred, that was actually something that was hyped up about that also, about how the protesters used the Twitter. And I feel as if that hype actually sold Twitter as a product. I actually downloaded myself Twitter because of that very reason. I was like, well, maybe I can organize my own revolution, but I actually found I had no use for Twitter. Yes?
You mentioned at the start that Kader was wearing a hoodie.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on the significance of that a little bit?
I mentioned that quote about it being the uniform of the disenfranchised worldwide. I've seen other quotes where somebody referred to it as the uniform of the contemporary proletariat. I've also seen, surrounding the murder of Trayvon Martin, actually, there was a lot of discussion of African American males wearing hoodies and that somehow being threatening, perhaps because of the ability to sort of veil your face. Although I wear a hoodie a great deal of the year. I don't know what that says about me.
I do too.
Yes, sir?
So, since 2000, we've seen the destruction of the Buddhas at Bamiyan. We just recently had the destruction of the temple at Palmyra and the looting of the Cairo Museum, the bulldozing of Jonah's tomb in Iraq, all at least by the people who did it in the name of Islam. What do you see about, I'm trying to think, how are we going to balance legitimate concerns about cultural approbation with this kind of destructive tendency that's coming out of the Middle East? Even the Muslim Brotherhood that temporarily ran Egypt immediately began to talk about the destruction of the Great Pyramids since they predated Islam and had, as they quoted it, nothing to do with Islam. How are we going to balance that out?
Well, I can't speak to how we're going to balance it out, but I do. When I first approached the project, I actually was thinking about it in relation to history of iconoclasm, because there definitely is an element in here. My professors actually urged me to not try to tackle that, however, because iconoclasm, in a variety of different, it was something that occurred in a more Asian Buddhism. It's something that's occurred in Christianity by both the Catholics and the Protestants. And in each context, temporally and geographically, they have different meanings. I would say, though, that there is something in relation to contemporary issues with it where it raises a lot of questions about what we value and what about a society and what that particular society values about themselves. I certainly especially the Palmyra thing, I think it's all very disheartening, and certainly the people that are doing that, I think it's despicable, and I don't think it reflects the culture at large. But I think it does point to an issue of who is representing whom. I don't know if I,
There's not an answer. I don't
yeah,
think.
yeah, but I think it's a very good question. Yes?
I'm interested in your idea of the topological, and you said it was similar to a Mobius strip, right?
Mhm.
And that it kind of comes back on itself. And I want to continue with that metaphor in asking you about post-colonialism. And of course, Edward Said's book is more than 30 years old now, and there has been more recent post-colonial theory that begins to look at how it is not just Eurocentrism in the West, but also that the East itself is creating some of these stereotypes and then sometimes appropriating Western visual means to then perpetuate some of the stereotypes themselves. So I'm just wondering, as you begin to explore this with this methodology, this topological methodology, if your artist is also looking at within the culture themselves, how they are creating some of these ideas.
Well, I guess, I think the artist in particular, his dual citizenship sort of thing kind of speaks to that. The sort of, I think there's like a residue of colonialism. It's not something that can be reversed at this point. And I think I've actually read some things recently about that sort of. I don't know if I can pronounce his name correctly. Okwe Nzar. He's a South African. He speaks about the sort of petite modernities, these modernities that appear to be copying European modernity. And I think it's a complicated thing that I honestly don't think I can answer in full detail, but part of my essay that I didn't really include in here was about that residue of colonialism and how it continues to, at that point, things have just changed and they've taken a different trajectory than they previously would have.
Well, you alluded to it with showing the facade of the Cairo Museum, because it's a completely Western building.
Yeah.
But then again, Egypt, was under the Greeks and under the Romans and it's had contact with Greece and the rest of Europe for a very long time, so it's hard to kind of separate that out.
Yeah, although that particular building was built while the French were in control of it, and where Beaux Arts architecture was in
English too. They were some of the early French and English.
Yeah, I think that the museum itself was under French directorship and French origins for a long time. There was a point I was going to make about that, but I lost it.
Okay, I just have one comment too. I was in Athens when the riots were happening, and the media bought out all of the hotel rooms around the square, and they were up there with their cameras. They were just ready. So it's like a media circus. It's almost like they're feeding off of it and then portraying this. And believe me, the rest of the country was fine. You're seeing these images on TV and Twitter and your iPhone, and the rest of the country's fine. There's one little square in all of Greece that this is happening. I'm not saying it's fine financially, but as far as violence, the violence was very, very localized.
And that's interesting. There's another sociological journal article that I read that demonstrated that not only did they occur largely outside of the region, but that a great deal of the social media was actually that was accessed by people was funneled through traditional news agencies, Al Jazeera or the BBC in particular. And they play up the democratic quality of it, but they're really still selecting what we're viewing. Any other questions? Thank you.
Next have Kate Zurawski. She's from Texas Tech, and her presentation is entitled Through the Flattening Stream.
Testing. Hello. Hi everyone. How are you guys doing today? Woo! Last presentation. Okay. Hi, my name is Kate Zurawski. I make jokes when I'm nervous. So I was excited from Texas Tech University. Me and Sarah actually were in the same class together. Peanuts girl. Apparently I wasn't with this whole hip black background thing, so I'm sorry if my presentation's kind of bright for everyone. But yeah, so my name is Kate Zurawski, and I'm going to be talking to you guys today about contemporary artist Takahashi Murakami and his connection with Japanese consumerism. All right, let's go. So as most of us have probably learned about in contemporary art, the advancement of technology has been affecting the way in which society views and produces art. As computer technologies and new media advanced during the 21st century, society's mode of viewing and ultimately consuming changes of that in real time to that in digital. How many times have we looked something up online before buying it in real life, or even cut out the middleman and just ordered something online? We have transitioned from a Fordist society to a post-Fordist society. In post-war Japan, consumption and consumerism became very important to Japanese society. Artist and animator Takahashi Murakami was influenced by this and used his super flat art and animation to flatten the world in order to criticize Japan's increasing dependency on consumerism through frames. After World War II, during the 1960s and 1970s, Japan entered a period of rapid economic growth. Post-World War II, Japan's labor force transitioned from agriculture to modern industry, resulting in a rise in productivity. This shift from agriculture to urban, combined with Japan's positive economic growth, resulted in an increase in consumerism. Japan became highly commercialized and consumerized country. On top of that, in the late 20th century, society experienced a shift from Fordism to post-Fordism, which resulted in a new outlook on production and consumption of goods. Unlike Fordism that approached a mass market of people with mass production, post-Fordism viewed consumers as different groups pursuing different goals who could be better served by small batches of specialized goods, meaning that people are targeted for their taste and their culture rather than their social class. The labor process became more flexible, and there was a decline in the old manufacturing process and a growth in computer-based industries. Post-Fordism emphasized communication, and due to this increase in communication, as well as access to information about the international art market, Takahashi Murakami is able to capture these new ideas about consumerism in his art and his art and animation, later identified as super flat. Early in his life, Takahashi Murakami, hold up. Let me just, okay. Early in his life, can you guys hear me? Yes? Okay. Takahashi Murakami aspired to become an animator. He was particularly interested in joining animator Yoshinori Kanada, a Japanese filmmaker known for his sci-fi animation in the late 1970s and 1980s. He was also influenced by Hayao Miyazaki, who animated such films as Castle in the Sky and Spirited Away. Murakami particularly appreciated Miyazaki's scene design for Isao Takahata's animated series Anne of Green Gables. Therefore, because Murakami felt his animation would not be up to par, in 1986, he switched his major at Tokyo University of the Arts to Nihon Ga. He felt that he would have the skills necessary to become a background artist for animation. Nihonga is a traditional painting technique made in accordance with traditional Japanese conventions, techniques, and materials. These techniques are over 1,000 years old and typically consist of scrolls and water-based paints. Murakami would still explore animation in his spare time and would later combine his artistic style with Nihonga. Murakami began exploring contemporary art and consumerism early on. In an interview, Murakami even stated that in Japan, all luxurious items are highly taxed, which made it extremely difficult for some justifiable reason for items such as art to continue to exist, as there is little incentive to support and purchase them. Hence, there has been very little flow of money in such fields as the pure arts, whereas it has been very easy for money to accumulate in the realm of commercial art. He therefore saw commercial art as one that could accumulate money. Murakami developed an aesthetic with eye-catching colors and often has a very friendly animated nature that only on closer observation may have a darker meaning behind it. This aesthetic can be likely compared to the face of consumerism, friendly at first but darker underneath. This aesthetic was crafted through Murakami's studio, the Kai Kiki Factory, earlier known as the Heropin Factory. Murakami was interested in animation studios like Walt Disney, Lucasfilm, and Hayao Miyazaki's Ghibli studio. Much like Andy Warhol's factory, Murakami's factory allowed him to work on his art in a larger scale. Murakami understood and identified that he needed other artists with specific areas of expertise to aid him in his artistic aesthetic.